welcome back to the studio. Today I'm going to be working with something other than a Urban Elementz or an Applique Elementz sample. I'm going to be working with an art quilt, and I'm going to be trying something that is a little unusual. I'm going to be trying to think a little bit outside the box for an Urban Elementz pantograph. Normally we think of pantograph designs as edge to edge, the border designs as all four borders. Today I'm going to be using a design called Feather Flurry. The design was created by Quilters Apothecary, which would be Jamie Wallen, and it was also worked on by Patricia Ritter. This design is typically used on all four borders of a quilt. It has a triangle pattern that would easily be accessible in a mitered corner of a quilt. Today I'm going to be utilizing it on an art quilt, and I'm only going to use it as one band on the quilt. It will be on the right hand side of the quilt, and it's just going to run from top to bottom. Because I'm using this design to run from top to bottom, I have loaded the quilt horizontally, not vertically. That way I could access the whole length of this quilt in one pass, and I have decreased the size that the pattern called for a little bit. Recommended height was 10 inches, and I think I'm somewhere just a little bit north of 9 inches. I'm also going to be trying something else in addition to just using it as a design element, not an overall quilting design. I'm going to be double stitching, and by that I mean I'm going to do a single pass in a gold Isacord thread, a non-metallic, and then I'm going to go back to my start position and reload with gold metallic. And I'm going to overstitch on top of the design with the gold metallic. And I understand just from before I even start that although the IntelliQuilter is very precise, there's no way for me to start over again after it's done the whole run and get it to stitch out exactly on top of itself. And this is what I want. I want it to have areas where it's slightly off, create a little bit of an echo between the gold Isacord and the gold metallic, and I want it to overstitch. Normally, and I've said this before, I recommend that we use a thread color that is low contrast, that blends with the background, and I do this most of the time. But in this particular piece, I want this design element to pop. So I'm going to be using gold on a black background. I'm going to be using both metallic and Isacord, and it's going to be double stitched. So I intend for this design to really pop. It's going to be countering a piece of sashing on the left hand side of the quilt, which won't be visible as I'm working. So I'm already loaded the design onto the machine. I just downloaded it from urbanelements.com. Again, it's a triangular pattern. It has a feather inside, and this pattern could be mirror imaged back and forth to repeat over and over on a whole quilt, but it was intended, I believe, as a border element, a 10-inch border. But today we're just going to be using it as a design element, so I'm going to go ahead and move the camera and show you my setup and get the design loaded so that we can see what this is going to look like and make any adjustments that I need to for placement. As I said, this is a large art quilt. It's part of a series of quilts, all on the theme of angels. And what we're going to be doing, I have the quilt loaded horizontally. The right hand side is my top edge of the quilt, and the right hand side is where this design is going to be stitched out. You can see that the background is a dark black silk du peony, and we're going to be stitching on it today with gold Isacord thread and then a gold metallic. I believe it's a superior metallic thread, but I'll let you know when I get there. So I already have the quilt loaded. It's got 2 layers of batting on it, so I anticipate that this design will really pop with detail. The bottom layer is a cotton, 100% cotton, I have the dimples facing up, the pimples facing down. On top of that, I have a layer of 100% wool, and that wool does two things. If the quilt ever gets folded, it helps the quilt resist the crease lines, but also because the wool is dimensional, puffy, it's really going to make that quilting design pop out. So I'm going to go ahead and get the IQ set up with the design, and then we'll do our 2 passes. After that's finished, that pretty much will wrap up the video for today, but I will be taking the quilt off of the frame and reloading it so that it's vertical instead of horizontal, and then I'll probably just be doing matchsticks in the background. Eventually I want to get to the point where I can do design a pantograph on the quilt and eliminate the stitching where the design is at. There's a name for that escapes me at the moment, but I haven't learned how to do it yet. So as I said, I'm just learning the IQ, and so this is both a training exercise and an illustration. I did practice this double stitching technique on blank fabric before I started taping several weeks ago, but it's still going to be a learning curve. So you're going to be watching with trepidation with me as I stitch on this finished quilt. The first part of this is going to be similar to what I've done before. We're going to design sew quilt. I'm going to select Start New because it's a new project. Do I want to erase anything in progress? Yes, I do. Am I sure? Yes. And I'm going to start with a new clock. Tell me how long this project worked, lasted, it took. If that was of any interest to me. For me personally, it isn't. I don't track my time on a quilt. For me, it takes however long it takes. So if somebody ever asks me how long it took to make something, I always tell them 30 years because that's how long I've been quilting, and that's how long it took me to get to this point today to where I can do what I'm doing with or without mistakes. So if someone wants to know how long it took, that's how long it took for me. So I'm going to reset my clock. I'm going to be doing a pantograph, but today I'm going to mark on quilt. Normally I enter the rectangle manually because that's the whole size of the quilt, and you can't do that. You can't measure that way with a whole quilt because you can't, everything's on the roller. Today the whole surface that I'm going to quilt is available on the top, and I also want to use this as a way to track how even I have the quilt loaded, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to hit mark on quilt, and it's going to ask me to move the needle to the first point. I'm going to do that, but first I'm going to move the camera back so we can get access to the whole area that I'm going to be working on. Okay, the design is going to be stitched out from this corner all the way down to here. It's about 9 inches, so I'm going to start my measuring. I haven't clicked OK yet, so I'm going to start my measuring in the upper left hand corner. I'm coming in about a ½ inch to start because this fabric had a selvage on it and the selvage is still on the fabric. So I'm basically coming down just enough to bypass the selvage, so that will be trimmed off when the quilt is finished. And I can go directly to the actual edge of the quilt because I'm marking this on the quilt. It will actually stitch out to there and stop. And if I have to trim off 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch at the top and bottom, that's okay because it's still raw fabric anyway. It's going to have to be trimmed. So I'm going to go ahead and make my first mark. Okay. Now there's a starting line here, which is a new point. We still have our crosshairs which tell me where the needle's at, but there's a line that's going to keep stretching as I move down the quilt. And I hope that you can see that you can see the angle of that. But if I keep the stitching line and the crosshairs even, then I know that we're creating a straight line in the program. So I'm going to use that to just make some marks across the quilt. I don't really have to do too many. And you can see these lines turn red after I've clicked 2 points. That's actual stitching line. So I'm going to go down to the very edge of the quilt. And now I can move down in a vertical pattern, and I'm going to measure for that. I'm going to move down about 9 inches, and I'm just doing that as a rough measurement. And again, the line here on the side, I could move this side to side and see if I'm in a straight line or not. And in doing that, I can see that my side is not perfectly straight, the fabric on the quilt, but the program is. So now I just have to move. I don't have to do any points in between because those would just be confusing. If they weren't perfectly straight, I would only be adding confusion to myself. So all I have to do is go back to the very edge, and I'm using my stitched line, my start point up here, to make sure it's perfectly perpendicular. And the last thing it's going to say is, well, here it says I can close block, which would just go back up to the start point. So I can go ahead and do that. And now, as I zoom back in, you'll be able to see that I have a red rectangular box, which is where my design is going to stitch out. So I can hit finish. Because I've already selected Pantograph and I was already in this earlier, it has pulled up my downloads, but I could go to Urban Elements if my file was there, but I just downloaded that design today, so the file is still in my downloads file. Here is the actual design. It's called Feather Flurry, and you can see I changed the ending of it to incorporate what the recommended height of this design should be, and it says 10 inches. So I know that's about how big the pattern should be, and that's just useful information for me. A lot of the other ones don't have it yet, but I'm going to go back in. Spindle does, because I added that last week. But that's useful information to me because I didn't design these patterns. They're all copyrighted, but the designer knows what size they were. I don't necessarily know that, so that is helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and hit continue. This is asking me for the odd rows. It won't let me proceed without it, but I'm just going to go ahead and select that, even though I'm only going to be sewing one row. Now you can see that the design came up and it centered this design for me. If I needed to have moved this design, I could have offset it one way or the other, and I just hit offset, and you can see the design is scrolling, and I could have scrolled it in either direction. But I could have this point be towards the center, or I could have that point, the center triangle, pointing to the outside. But visually, I'm going to make a design decision. I think I want that center triangle to be pointing directly inward, which would be pointing at the artwork itself, the angel. So I have this V design, which is the center of the quilt, pointing inwards, which would be pointing towards the angel. And as far as the design decision, that's what I choose. So it has both endings are cut off in exactly the same proportion, which is fine. So I can go ahead and hit finished. And it's asking me for clipping confirmation because it's going to clip those off. I'm going to accept it and accept the transition. So now the design is finished as far as the program. I just have to get it into position and start quilting. So I can go ahead and select Start Quilt, and we're going to select the first pattern, and there really is only one. and you can see the ending is on the right hand side, the start is on the left hand side. This is kind of hard for you to see. There is an S1 in a block there. That's my first starting point, but because the pattern and that little block are both green, it may not be visible to you on the video. But I know that my starting point is on the left, the finish point's on the right, and so I've already hit the pattern to select, and I'm going to continue. Now if I wanted to, I could swap the start and end point so it started on the right and finished on the left, but I don't really think it matters. So I'm just going to leave it as it is. And now I'm ready to select Sew Quilt, in which point it will go ahead and start taking to the very first starting position, and we'll pull up our thread. I already have gold Isacord thread, and I have gold Isacord thread in the bobbin, and the machine is all loaded, so I'm ready to start quilting. I'm a little bit nervous, but I'm going to go ahead and select Sew Quilt, and the machine's automatically going to start moving to the start position. Once it gets to the start position, it will take a single stitch, allowing me to pull the thread up, and then it's going to ask me to start again, and it will sew out what is basically the one pattern that I'm going to be stitching today from start to finish. It's also asking me to switch to manual, which I do need to do. My machine has to be on manual so that the IQ can control the programming. So I've done that. And I've switched the foot I'm using today, so I'm going to keep an eye on that a little bit. I haven't used this particular foot yet, but I'm going to go ahead and select Start. I didn't actually have a thread break. I don't know why it said that, but I went ahead and restarted it, and it looks to be sewing fine. One of the things that I always have to watch out for, a lot of times when I'm sewing on the machine manually, I will smooth out the quilt as the machine is moving. I'll have my hand on the machine moving it, and I'll smooth the quilt. I can't do that when the IQ is working because I'm shifting the position of the quilt, but the program doesn't know that. And so it will create a misalignment of the pattern. So I have to be careful not to do that. And the design is stitching out. Visually it may be a little bit larger than what I wanted, but I think in the end it's going to be fine. I learn something every time I sew, and the way I learn is by boldly blundering into mistakes. I could have painstakingly drew out this design. I could have done a million things to measure it, but I don't have time to do that. There's so many quilts I want to make. So sometimes I just go ahead and do something and then learn from it. And I don't beat myself up about the results. If I can finish a project, then that is what's important to me. I don't want to labor over decisions to the extent that I don't get anything accomplished. I'm going to stop the camera and move it in a little bit so we can see this stitch out a little bit closer. I love this design by Jamie Wallen. It's a beautiful feather design, and I really like what it's going to add to the side of this quilt. And then when the whole thing is finished, I'll probably just do an echo line along the whole edge of it, and then do matchsticks or something that I could do in the background. But that will all be done in black thread, so it really doesn't show up. It's just going to be adding texture. I'm at the end of the design, so now's the test to see if I know what I'm doing. I'm going to hit Sew Quilt again, and Sew Quilt. I'm going to move the needle down to the beginning again. I have a superior thread. This happens to be a variegated gold metallic. On the inside of the cone, there's some useful information. It tells me that this is a 40 weight metallic, variegated gold, but it also has information. On a home machine, it's recommending a top stitch needle, size number 90/14. On the long arm, it's recommending a size 18. So that's useful information. This also, I'm looking at the spool. This is cross-wound thread, so I'm going to use it on the top spool holder. If this was stacked thread, I would use it on my vertical or my horizontal spool holder. So I'm going to pay attention to that. And I'm going to go ahead and thread this through the machine, making sure my tension discs are up. One of the other important things I'm going to do is make a pretty drastic adjustment to my tension. I know in the past when I've used metallic thread that I've had to greatly reduce my top tension. My default on the Bernina Q24 is a 4.0, and I'm going to go down somewhere in the vicinity of 1.5. Now that's a really drastic reduction in top tension, but I need to do that because I don't want the thread to be breaking over and over. But I'll check that here on the side at the beginning. I'm going to hold the top of the thread as I feed it through the tension disc. If I do that, then I know that it has captured the thread and the tension disc. If I fail to do that, it doesn't always get caught in the tension disc, and then I'm getting those horrible loops on the back of the quilt. So I have the thread through the machine, all except the needle. I'm going to go ahead and touch my top tension, and I'm going down from 4.0 to 1.5 to start. Would you believe there's a needle threader on here and I never use it? I don't know why, but I just don't like it. I've never given it a chance either, so I'm back at restart, and it says move needle to the restart location and touch OK. And I can see on the screen up here, I want to make sure you can see, that I can go back to my original start point. There's a S1, start 1, that's the start of my first row. And what I could do is make sure that the needle matches up with where the actual start of that design is. And I can see it's off just a little bit. So I'm going to hit realign. I'm going to go to my start 1 is my realignment point. I've touched the reference point. Now I'm going to move the needle right to that point and hit OK. And I'm still not there yet. So I'm going to keep making adjustments until I get it right back to that start point. Okay, I think I finally got the machine to acknowledge that I want it to restart the design. I've got back to the start point, I think. So I'm going to hit start. And I'm going to be optimistic about whether it's going to start the design or not. But I'll know pretty quick from the upper left-hand corner how far off I am. So I'm going to go ahead, fingers crossed, and press start. The machine is stitching. We did get it to restart. It skipped the very two elements in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm not going to try and go back and figure out why it did that or get it to re-stitch over it. I'll zoom in a little bit and let you see a closer look. You're going to see that the design fades in and out of perfection. Some places it's going to be a little bit more off than others. I'm completely okay with that, but I think you can see just from the position of the camera now what the double stitching is going to do for the design and how it's going to make that design glow with the metallic, but also strengthen the impact of this design. Before I zoom in, I did want to say the reason I chose this particular design by Quilters Apothecary called Feather Flurry was because the feathers remind me of the angel feathers, and the topic of this quilt is the angel. It's the Annunciation. So that was why I chose this design for this quilt. And I will move the camera in and let you get a closer look of the stitching in just a moment. I wanted to pause the camera so I can move the handlebars out of the way without it stitching on the quilt. You can see I'm off the quilt here. I think after watching this for a few minutes, I'm going to call this double digital. Some of the designs echo a little bit more than other areas. Even if you were trying to manually do feathers, or some of you know this from doing backtracking, that backtracking is very difficult. And part of this misalignment is a little bit due to my start and stop point. I may have been able to get a more exact replication if I had saved the design and just hit restart. I don't know. I may try that again on another quilt. But I really love the way that the design is echoed. Because it is echoed and offset a little bit over the entire quilt, it will look like a design decision. And the impact is certainly much stronger. Some of you will think this was a fail, and some of you will be excited about it. Both are fine with me, but I think I'm going to be very happy with the end result once it's finished. And I like the variegation on that gold metallic. It's really going to give you a shimmer as you walk by the quilt. We're coming to the end of the design. Just has a little bit more to do the inside and the upper corner. So this will pretty much be the conclusion of the video. What we've done today is used double digital quilting. We've overstitched on the design twice. You can see it's offset. I like the way that it creates motion, and it almost made ribbons out of some of the feathers. Some of you may not like it. Some of you may love it. I've used regular Isacord thread, but I've also used metallic thread by following the manufacturer's recommendation for the needle, and by reducing the top tension. I didn't have any problems with thread breaking due to the use of metallic. I did have to change the bobbin. This is a particularly dense design, so each row required almost a full bobbin. And this should just about be the end of it. I think I'm going to go back to the very upper left-hand corner. There's two little segments that didn't quite get stitched out with the metallic, and it looks empty from here. I'm going to pan over that way so you can see. You see in that far corner, it looks like there's no stitching. And there is the Isacord thread there, there's just not the metallic. So that gives you an idea of the impact that the metallic thread added to this design. It has a lot of sparkle, there's some variegation in the thread, it's stitched out really nice. So I'm just going to go back and try and fill those two things in, and then I'll be finished. Then it's just a matter of me taking the quilt off and flipping it so that it's vertical instead of horizontal, and then I'll just do a background fill in black thread here so that it doesn't really compete with the applique or with this punch of design here with the stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and finish those two things, but thanks for stopping in today and watching our double digital and our metallic thread test, and we'll see you next time.